Fonterra make more money than any other company in New Zealand. They account for 25% of our exports and process the products from a full 5% of our land area. They have operations spanning from the bottom of the South Island to the top of the North Island and all over the globe. They are probably the biggest thing in New Zealand that isn't the government. So today we're going to talk about Fonterra, how bloody huge it is, how it works, how it's going to work in the future, and what it means to have such a monolithic entity at the centre of our country's biggest primary industry. To talk about dairy, you have to start with farmers and cows. There are about 11,000 dairy farms in New Zealand that farm about 4.8 million cows. 58% of these are in the North Island and 42% are in the Best Island, with Taranaki, Southland, Canterbury and the Waikato being major dairy regions. It's truly a national industry. Dairy farms use about 1.7 million hectares of land, which is 6% of New Zealand's entire land area. 6%! The output of these farms is measured in kilograms of milk solids, or kgms. This is the parts of milk that aren't water. This is fat, casein, whey, lactose and some other stuff. New Zealand produces 1.8 billion kilograms of milk solids per year from 21 billion litres of milk per year. 6,000 of the 11,000 farmers farm and own their own land. About 1,500 are contract milkers where they're paid by the landowner, and the rest are all share milkers, where different people own different parts of the operation. I think generally this is one landowner and one cow owner, and then they split the profits 50-50. But I think there's lots of different arrangements you can do with this, and they all choose profit split based on who's putting what into the operation. This allows people without the resources to own a whole farm to be involved in dairying. Milk production in New Zealand is extremely seasonal. Its peak in October is 20 times higher than its low in June. 20 times more in October than it is in June. Farmers' work ends when a big milk truck comes to pick up their milk. They are paid a set price for their milk by whichever company they're with. This is called the farm gate price because it's the price that they're paid at the farm gate. For 80% of New Zealand dairy farmers, the company that comes and collects their milk is Fonterra. Let's talk about that other 20% first. Fonterra's competitors are relatively tiny, but still huge businesses on a normal scale. The biggest one is Open Country Dairy. They're owned by a huge New Zealand company called Tally's Group, who do loads of food stuff. They have 4 processing plants around the country that process milk for about 1,000 farms. Like Fonterra, they export pretty much everything that they make. Other competitors are Oceania Dairy and Fonterra in Canterbury, and Westland in where else but the West Coast. There are probably a dozen more companies I could list here, but it's going into less than 1% of the market. Pretty much all of them have the same export-focused model as Fonterra does. Speaking of, let's get back to Fonterra. Fonterra was formed in 2001 when the 2 big dairy cooperatives in New Zealand tried to merge. They were initially blocked by the Commerce Commission, but then they went to Cabinet and Cabinet let them bypass the Commerce Commission. When they formed, they had 97% of milk production in New Zealand. 97%! They had about $12 billion in exports, and I can't find anything super direct about this, but it seemed like they were expected to get to 30 or 40 billion within 10 years. They're at 20 billion today, after 24 years, so it's pretty clear they didn't exactly hit their target. Fonterra was originally called Global Co. as a temporary name, and eventually called Fonterra after some Latin phrases. It's really funny to me that the opinions of a bunch of people on this name have been preserved. I don't know, it's just funny to me. There's an almost infinite amount you could say about this merger. It's one of the most complicated things to ever happen in New Zealand, but a lot of it doesn't seem to have made it into the digital age, or at least I can't find it. So unfortunately, that's all I have for you. But now we get to move on to Fonterra as it exists today. Fonterra is a cooperative. A cooperative is a business that's owned by people who are actually involved with it. Sometimes this is store owners or workers, but in Fonterra's case it is dairy farmers. There are loads of cooperatives in New Zealand, especially in the farming sector. Fonterra farmers must buy an amount of Fonterra shares between 33% and 400% of the amount of milk solids they produce. This structure is meant to tie Fonterra's goals to the farmers who produce the milk. It also allows the farmers to profit from the downstream price of their milk, as well as just the farm gate price. These shares are traded on a private stock market, and the total amount of shares is set by the Fonterra board. But there is a public index fund you can invest in if you'd like to. Now, back to the milk. Fonterra collects milk in one of these trucks. They have about 500 of them across the country, and they can operate almost 20 hours a day in the peak season. Together they collect 16 billion litres of milk a year to take to Fonterra plants. In 2021 they announced a competition to replace the trailer of these trucks. The entrants were a big trailer firm from the Waikato, an industrial company from the Waikato, and a truck driver from the Waikato called Bill. As far as I can tell, they never announced the winner of this, but personally I am absolutely rooting for Bill. The milk is sent to one of Fonterra's 28 plants. These are all across the country. Behind me is Edendale, Fonterra's oldest site, opened in 1882. It's also Fonterra's biggest site. They process 2.4 billion litres of milk every year here. Fonterra have so many sites that they hold an annual awards show for all of their different sites. Edendale in 2023 was the big winner. They won the best large site, they won the Quality Cup, and they won the Japan Protein Award. However, this year, 2024, they failed to win anything at all, or even runner-up in anything. I'm pretty excited to watch the 2025 version. I think it's pretty hilarious that there's a awards show for dairy manufacturing plants. Fonterra sells dairy naturally in supermarkets. It owns brands like Anchor, Primo, De Winkel, Perfect Italiano, Mainland, Mammoth, and I think there's a couple more I'm missing. Notice that despite you probably buying these brands occasionally, it's not 80% of the dairy aisle, and it's probably not 80% of your dairy consumption. Most of the other dairy brands are owned by a company called Goodman Fielder. Goodman Fielder is owned by a Singaporean company, and it's just a company that controls a huge amount of New Zealand's food brands. Just a huge amount of them. Look at the list. It just goes on and on and on and on and on. Goodman Fielder also happen to buy a lot of their dairy products from Fonterra. Fonterra have to supply at least 350 million kilograms of milk solids as raw milk to Goodman Fielder each year, and Goodman Fielder pay an extra 10 cents on the normal price for that. So a lot of Goodman Fielder products are also made with Fonterra dairy. Fonterra has to supply up at least 600 million kilograms of milk solids as raw milk to dairy companies that want it, up to 50 million to any individual dairy company that doesn't produce at least 30 million of their own. This is one small corner of Fonterra's extremely complicated and extremely specific regulation. I've never seen a company so specifically regulated. Like, all these regulations are specifically for Fonterra. I mean, I guess it makes sense though, because the government was legally creating a huge monopoly in one of our biggest industries. As well as handling 80% of New Zealand's milk, Fonterra also handles 17% of Australia's. Fonterra have 8 plants across Victoria and Tasmania, and a bunch of brands specifically for the Australian market, as well as a lot of the same Kiwi ones. They also have a plant in Sri Lanka, and they also have packaging and repackaging facilities all over the world. I'm not going to get into those because they don't matter for what we're talking about today. However, recently Fonterra's Australia business, Fonterra's Sri Lanka business, and all of its brands across New Zealand and Australia have been rolled up into one business segment called Fonterra Oceania. This has then been put up for sale. This is apparently to streamline Fonterra and to focus on selling business to business. In August of 2025, Fonterra signed a deal with Lactalis, a huge French dairy company, to buy this business segment for about $4 billion. There's obviously a few barriers to get a deal of this scale over the line. There's going to be a farmer's vote and stuff like that. And the farmer's vote's probably already happened since I'm recording this a long time before the video will come out. So this is the result of the farmer vote. As far as I can tell, this deal probably will go through in early 2026, though, when it's scheduled to. This means that now, even though it's New Zealand dairy produced in New Zealand, the brands you'll be buying it under are either owned by the French, owned by the Singaporeans, or often owned by somebody else. So if you don't want any of your money going to foreign interests when you buy dairy, these are the brands and places you should get that. It's getting harder and harder to do this, which you wouldn't expect for a country who produces as much dairy as we do. So now we get to what really is the core of Fonterra's business, selling New Zealand dairy to Asia. As I said earlier, Fonterra exports 95% of what they make. They sell to 160 countries around the world, and they export 200,000 containers of dairy a year. They even co-founded an exporting business with Silver Fern Farms, another huge agriculture company called Cooperative. This handles, as best as I can tell, the majority of New Zealand's exports. There's so many little things like this that Fonterra just do that kind of aren't picked up on. Fonterra is in the top 2 or 3 dairy exporters. They focus most of their effort on selling business to business in Asia. This is where most of their focus is, and as best as I can tell, this is their primary business thing and where they think they have the most growth. So that's Fonterra's business and how they operate and how their industry works. And surely this operates with absolutely no possible downsides, right? Well, there are a few I figured are worth mentioning. A lot of New Zealand's rivers, especially in livestock areas, are thick. Fertiliser, sediment and livestock poo can cause algal blooms, make rivers unsafe to drink. They can cause ecosystem degradation. This isn't a super well understood, but it is definitely true to some extent that livestock raising and dairying are bad for rivers. There's a lot of attention been brought to this the last few years, and Fonterra have been working with DOC to reduce the impact that their farmers have on rivers. This stuff is pretty hard to quantify or measure Fonterra's specific impact on. It's just not an area we've got the tools to research properly, as best as I can tell. Yes, this is one of my videos, so we had to get to energy at some point, and Fonterra uses a goddamn load of it. Fonterra is one of the biggest users of electricity in our country, one of the biggest users of gas in our country, and one of the biggest users of coal in our country. Fonterra has a subsidiary called Glencoal that used to run a whole bunch of different mines, but in modern history it's only run the Kopuku mine in the Waikato. This is one of the biggest coal mines in the North Island. It sold that mine to Bathurst Minerals in 2017, but it had a permit to develop another mine in the same area, which it gave up in 2018. So Glencore doesn't do anything anymore. Fonterra buys all its coal from other mines. So I don't know why Glencore is still a company. It still seems to exist, just doesn't actually do anything. As of this year, Fonterra have gotten rid of all coal usage at their North Island sites, moving them to either wood pellets or to gas. Fonterra are trying to move their South Island sites away from coal, but if you see my gas video, you know where they can't use gas. But they can and are using wood pellets as biofuel to convert them. But the main way Fonterra are trying to move off of coal and eventually move off of gas is with electrifying heat, using electric boilers. Here at Edendale, they got the first electric boiler, announced in early 2024. Uses about 20 megawatts of power and reduces about 20% of the emissions from the plant. They have electrifying heat projects of various scales on various different stages that will do various amounts at lots of different plants. So Fonterra use loads of coal and gas, but that is nowhere near the most carbon emitting part of their business. 25% of New Zealand's emissions come from dairy cows. 25%! That's more than transport, power generation and fugitive emissions put together. This is the problem with dairy cows globally, but due to our pretty low population and insanely high number of dairy cows, it's extremely pronounced here. Dairy cows are 94% of Fonterra's emissions. 94%. That is an insane number, considering the other 6% is burning coal and gas, using electricity, shipping stuff, and driving 500 of the biggest diesel trucks in the country around almost constantly. 20% of our emissions are specifically Fonterra dairy cows. Cows don't produce carbon dioxide like burning coal or gas does, though they produce methane. Because we measure carbon statistics in what's called CO2 equivalents, methane is converted into an equivalent of carbon dioxide, which is obviously way more potent, which is why our 4.8 million dairy cows produce way more than our millions of cars and trucks. Fonterra have also had a few run-ins with toxic milk. In 2008, a Chinese company called Sanlu, which Fonterra owned 43% of, was found to be putting melamine into its infant formula. This was eventually found to have killed 6 babies and poisoned 300,000. Apparently Fonterra did all the right things, at least according to the New Zealand Prime Minister, but still was a huge loss for them, and they ended up having to write off their entire share of Sanlu. It just completely lost investment for them. Ironically, this could have actually been a good thing long-term for Fonterra because it massively tainted the reputation of Chinese milk in China, and a lot of, China's growing middle class would spring the extra few dollars to buy overseas milk, and especially from countries like New Zealand with a cleaner reputation. Fonterra even talk about this in the way they talk about China and their marketing strategy there. Check this video out.
Food safety is a major concern across China, and imported milk is a highly valued commodity.
就是怕担心，因为吃进去怕这个毒排不出来，所以就是说宁可花贵一点的钱，就是品质好一点的东西。
Families like Dandans are the future of China. Fonterra is proud to be helping them access safe, high-quality dairy nutrition.
In 2013, there was a recall of about 1,000 tons of Fonterra dairy from all around the world, when it was found to have a bacteria in it that could have caused botulism. Luckily, the bacteria wasn't one that could actually cause that, but it was still a huge issue in Fonterra's supply chain that this bacteria was able to get into that milk. Ultimately, it was not a huge hit to their reputation long term. Fonterra have also had a lot of controversy through their use of palm kernel as supplemental cow feed. I'm not going to get into it, but I needed to mention it given how extensive the history of that controversy is. And I could probably keep going on and on about more and more minor things here forever, but I think it's time to stop talking about the past and start talking about the future. For the scale that it is, Fonterra is a relatively young company. Milk's been a pretty stable commodity for Fonterra's entire history. I think Fonterra will probably continue losing ground with dairy farmers to other dairy companies as it's been doing for years, but I think it'll probably stay pretty stable in terms of its farmer base, and with their sale of their Australian and consumer product business to Lactalis, they're probably just going to be focusing the company even more on producing in New Zealand and exporting to Asia, which seems stable at the very least. There is, however, one technology that could massively affect Fonterra's future: precision fermentation. I will never claim to know anything about biology, but my understanding, precision fermentation is where you create little microorganisms that can create proteins that you would normally need a cow to get. So you can create little organisms that can create things like casein and whey without needing to use a cow at all, except for maybe to get the DNA of those proteins. Don't quote me on that, don't know anything about biology. There's an absolute pile of companies working on this, including a Kiwi company called Daisy Lab. And you can even buy some of these precision fermented products in supermarkets, like Formo stuff from Riwi supermarkets in Germany. I don't know how to pronounce any of that. And precision fermentation as a technology has existed in some form for ages. These products have a long way to go with regulatory hurdles, supply chains, and just scaling in general. And even after all that, working out if they can actually be sold at a price that is competitive to standard dairy. But if they can work out how to make it cost competitive with standard dairy, it becomes a direct threat to Fonterra. So naturally, Fonterra is involving themselves in this work. world. In 2019, they invested in a company called Motif Ingredients who made precision fermented animal fats. Or they did. In 2024, they shut down. As far as I can tell, Fonterra's never mentioned this outside their initial buying announcement, so I presume that they completely lost their entire investment in Motif. But their main entry into the space is a startup that they have called Vivici, which they have with a huge Dutch conglomerate called Royal DSM. And the idea seems to be that these huge Dutch company and the huge New Zealand company can put all their knowledge and IP and technology and scale together to create something that will at least stop them from being left behind in a world where precision fermentation is a thing. That's what I think is going on. I think, however, this raises an obvious question. In a world where precision fermented milk proteins become cheap and prevalent, Fonterra's farmers, the people Fonterra are legally required to benefit, are producing milk for a world that doesn't need it. What is Fonterra New Zealand's reaction to our biggest primary industry being potentially completely replaced by a new technology? Fonterra's response to that is that it won't happen. Fonterra says that the amount of dairy and protein required by the world is going to go up significantly, and precision fermented dairy could help in fulfilling that gap between what current dairy produces and what the demand for dairy is going to be in the future. Basically saying that these industries will coexist and current dairy will not be affected by precision fermentation. They seem to have complete belief in precision fermentation as a technology, but also complete belief that it won't substantially affect the amount of real milk that is required. It's definitely possible precision fermentation never works as a technology and Fonterra is completely unaffected. It's also entirely possible that it does just fill that gap between what real dairy can provide and what the global demand for dairy is, and it never becomes competitive in the core dairy market. And it's also possible that Fonterra's status as a cooperative means it can't ditch its farmers. And even if the global dairy market gets much smaller, Fonterra becomes a bigger part of it as other companies that can legally ditch their farmers do. And Fonterra basically gains market share in a smaller market and ends up at the same scale as it was. But it's also possible that this industry might one day massively wipe out any kind of large-scale dairy industry. It's definitely something to watch, not just for Fonterra's sake, but for New Zealand as a whole. So that's Fonterra. Fonterra are an insanely complicated company. I'm just going to put a list of things on screen here that I didn't mention about them. And thank you for watching this video. This has taken me well over a year to make. The first clips were filmed over a year ago. The first ones were the ones at Edendale. So because of that, some of the stuff I say might actually have become outdated by the time the video comes out. I'm trying to correct as much of that as I can in editing, but we'll see. But I probably will end up missing something, so I do apologize about that. I'm going to leave the information of the other factories I managed to drone film, but didn't film in front of, just at the end after this. And finally, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.